groom was the first to sense it. As he approached the old forest for the midnight walk, villagers swore a shadow moved in front of him, even though he hadn't taken a step. And when he finally returned, his eyes were fixed on a point behind him, as if something had followed him back from the tree line. "If you stay, I'll show you the unsettling rituals meant to protect newlyweds from the unseen rituals like the shadow dance, the veiled judgment, and the circle of embers." Traditions that reveal how deeply medieval people feared the world they lived in. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. In the dim twilight of medieval Europe, where superstition shaped every whisper and tradition carried the weight of generations, weddings were not simply celebrations of love, but rituals woven from fear, fate, and the unspoken belief that unseen forces watched every moment. And as the sun dipped beneath the hills and the world shifted into that uncertain space between light and shadow, a medieval wedding began long before the bride ever walked toward her groom, beginning instead with omens, signs, and rituals meant to guard a future no one could predict. And villagers understood that choosing the wrong day meant inviting misfortune, so families waited for nights when moonlight fell evenly on the earth, believing a balanced moon foretold a balanced marriage. And when the alignment felt right, the quiet preparations began, each step wrapped in secrecy, beginning with the binding cloth, a length of hand-woven fabric that elders claimed carried the memory of everyone who had touched it. And this cloth, often older than the couple themselves, was laid across the ground before dawn while no one watched, because they believed the air held different energies before sunrise, and the cloth would absorb whatever lingered there. And when the bride stepped upon it, she stepped onto the hopes, fears, and histories of her lineage, and the binding cloth was meant to tie her destiny to the household. She would soon join. Yet if the fabric shifted on its own, even slightly, villagers whispered that a spirit had walked across it too, and such a sign meant the marriage would require stronger protections, leading to one of the eeriest traditions of all. The listening hour. A ritual held the night before the wedding when the bride sat alone in a room lit by a single taper candle, forbidden to speak as older women gathered outside the door and pressed their ears to the wood, not to hear her voice but to hear what answered the silence around her, because they believed the air itself carried messages about her future. And if the candle flickered without wind, or if soft creaking stirred within the walls, elders claimed the spirits were restless, and a restless spirit required appeasement. So the bride's jewelry, simple pieces of metal or polished stone, was placed on cold earth outside under the moonlight to cool the energy of the unseen, and if dew settled upon the jewelry by morning, they believed it had been accepted. But if the pieces remained dry, it meant the unseen had refused the offering, prompting yet another layer of ritual. And this was when the villagers turned to the shadows of the old forests that bordered many medieval towns, for they believed those forests held ancient knowledge, no book ever captured. And so the groom, accompanied by his closest friend, would walk to the edge of the trees and stop just beyond the reach of moonlight, never entering, only waiting, because the custom insisted that a groom should offer silence to the forest in exchange for a smooth wedding day. And if during that silence a single leaf drifted downward or a distant rustle echoed through branches, they took it as a sign that the forest had listened, and a listening forest meant the marriage would be watched over, though no one knew exactly by what. And as dawn approached, families gathered for the procession of shadows, an unsettling tradition in which villagers positioned themselves behind the bride rather than in front of her, believing that walking behind her forced any lingering misfortune to reveal itself. And as she moved forward, she was never allowed to look back, because turning her head was said to invite the past to follow her into her marriage. So she stared ahead with steady breath while footsteps echoed behind her in a slow, rhythmic pattern. And sometimes those footsteps were perfectly synchronized with her own. And when that happened, villagers claimed it meant an unseen presence was walking with her. And while no one openly admitted fear, every glance exchanged carried a silent question about whether such a presence brought protection or warning. And once the procession ended, attention shifted to the threshold test, a tradition rooted in the medieval belief that the entrance to a home was a boundary between worlds, a place where blessings and misfortune intertwined. So before a bride could enter her future household, she had to stand at the threshold while the groom traced a circle on the ground with a small branch, and the circle symbolized continuity, an unbroken flow of life. Yet if the branch snapped while tracing the circle even slightly, villagers gasped quietly because they believed something unseen had interfered, and when such interference occurred, the couple had to repeat the tracing 3 times until the circle held firm, and once completed, the groom lifted the bride over the threshold, a custom still known today, though in medieval times it came from a much stranger belief that whatever lingered beneath a doorway could cling to her feet and follow her inside, and lifting her was the only way to avoid bringing unknown energy into the home. And after she crossed the threshold, she did not speak, not even to her groom, until an elder handed her a cup of warmed herbs, a mixture meant to settle the spirit, sharpen intuition, and cleanse any invisible burden she might have unknowingly carried. And once she drank, the wedding feast could begin. Though feasts in medieval Europe carried their own strange traditions, and one of the most curious involved the silent toast, a moment where every guest raised their cup but no one drank, because drinking too early was believed to awaken jealousy from the unseen, and so the cups were held in the air, trembling slightly as arms grew tired until the bride lowered hers first, signaling that the time was safe, and only then did the feast truly begin. And throughout the meal, guests watched the couple closely for signs or omens, paying attention to the smallest details: a candle sputtering near the groom, a chair settling on its own, a draft brushing the bride's veil. Because each detail, no matter how ordinary, was interpreted through layers of superstition, and elders made mental notes of everything, believing that the symbols shown on a wedding day revealed the nature of the couple's future. And as night fell, the final tradition of part 1 emerged: the midnight walk, where the couple stepped outside together under the moonlight and took exactly 7 slow steps away from the celebration. Never more, never fewer. Because 7 symbolized balance, and once they reached the 7th step, they paused, as the world fell quiet around them. For medieval people believed that the future listened most closely at midnight, and the silence held stories, and if an owl called in the distance or a breeze shifted the bride's veil or the shadows lengthened strangely at their feet, the villagers watching from afar whispered interpretations, some hopeful, some uneasy, yet all of them rooted in the deep medieval belief that marriage was not simply a union of 2 people, but a negotiation with forces far older and far more mysterious than anyone dared to name aloud. And so part 1 closes with the couple standing in the stillness, unaware that the most unsettling traditions, the ones whispered only in secret, awaited them in the deeper hours of their wedding night. Traditions shaped not by love, but by fear of the unknown, the unexplained, and the memories of customs older than the villages that practiced them. As midnight settled over the village and the distant murmurs of the feast softened into a low hum beneath the night sky, the couple remained standing after their 7th step, suspended between celebration and superstition. And while guests slowly drifted back inside to warm themselves by the hearth, the elders stayed outside watching, waiting, listening for any sign the midnight walk had been accepted by whatever forces they believed hovered around such gatherings. And once the elders exchanged silent nods, a gesture signaling that the couple could safely return, the groom guided the bride back toward the flickering lantern light. But even then she was not allowed to look over her shoulder, for looking back during a wedding ritual was said to bend the path of fate, twisting the future into uncertainty, and so her gaze stayed fixed ahead, the world behind her dissolving into darkness she dared not acknowledge. And as they re-entered the hall, they were greeted by a ritual far stranger than the guests' cheerful applause, a tradition known as the veiled judgment, where the bride momentarily relinquished her veil to a circle of older women who inspected it for subtle signs of spiritual interference, holding the fabric up to torchlight and observing the way the shadows clung to its threads. And if the veil appeared unusually heavy, or if the torchlight dimmed while they studied it, they claimed a silent watcher had touched the fabric, and such a touch required immediate cleansing by waving dried herbs beneath it until the shadows shifted normally again. And once the veil was returned to the bride, she placed it back over her head, knowing the elders believed they had protected her from unseen intentions. Though whether the protection was genuine or simply tradition remained a question no one dared explore. For in medieval life, belief held more power than certainty, and certainty was a luxury few possessed. And soon after the inspection ended, the couple participated in yet another unsettling custom, called the hearth circle, in which they stood before the main hearth, the heart of any medieval home, and waited while an iron poker was placed into glowing embers until it grew just hot enough to simmer with light. And while the poker heated, the room grew unnervingly silent. For villagers believed that fire revealed truths hidden from mortal eyes, and when the iron glowed faintly red, it was lifted and held upright near the couple, not to touch them, but merely to cast its warmth across their faces, because the heat was thought to coax out any lingering ill omens, and if the poker flickered strangely or if the fire sputtered as though pushed by an unseen breath, the elders whispered that the spirits of the couple's ancestors were nearby, watching, weighing, deciding whether to bless or challenge the union. And once the fire ritual ended, the couple moved to the offering table, a small wooden stand covered with small tokens from villagers, simple items like polished stones, carved wooden charms, dried flowers, and handwritten pieces of parchment containing quiet wishes. And the couple was required to choose one object without knowing who placed it there, and the belief was that the object chosen reflected what the marriage would most need. So if they selected a stone, villagers interpreted it as a need for endurance. If they selected a wooden charm, it meant creativity and adaptability. And if they chose parchment, it meant their future required careful communication. And whatever object they picked was kept secretly by the bride until the first full moon after the wedding, when she would bury it outside to set the intention of their marriage into the earth itself. And while the festivities continued, an even stranger tradition took shape behind the scenes: the groom's passage. A brief but solemn moment when the groom was escorted by the oldest men in the village to a quiet corner of the hall, away from music and laughter, where he was told ancient sayings meant to prepare him for the responsibilities ahead, though these sayings rarely offered comfort, for medieval wisdom leaned heavily on warnings, such as the reminder that a household without harmony draws wandering shadows, or a promise made in daylight must withstand the judgment of night. And while the sayings were metaphorical, their tone carved a heaviness into the groom's thoughts, a lingering awareness that marriage, in medieval eyes, was not just a union but a fragile pact watched closely by forces no one fully understood. And once the men concluded their ritual, they returned the groom to the feast just in time for the shadow dance, a wedding custom that confused outsiders and unsettled even lifelong villagers, because during this dance the bride and groom did not face each other, but instead danced with their backs nearly touching, moving slowly in a circle as guests hummed an old wordless tune. And the idea behind the dance was that by moving in unison while facing opposite directions, the couple demonstrated their ability to protect one another from unseen threats, guarding each other's blind spots. And if their movements fell out of sync even briefly, it was taken as a sign that the marriage would face trials requiring extra vigilance. And on rare occasions, when the shadows cast by torchlight seemed to move differently than the couple, villagers murmured quietly, claiming the shadows themselves foretold the marriage's unseen challenges. But regardless of interpretation, the dance ended the same way, with the bride and groom turning at the exact same moment to face each other, a symbolic gesture meant to restore unity after the ritual separation. And once the dance concluded, the couple sat side by side at the high table as a bowl of water was placed before them, its surface still and reflective, and a single candle was positioned behind them, so that its light fell across the water, creating wavering patterns on the surface, and villagers gathered around to observe those flickering reflections, because this bowl, known as the marriage mirror, was believed to reveal hidden aspects of the future, and if the candlelight shimmered softly in natural waves, the elders nodded contentedly, for they believed it meant the couple would navigate life's uncertainties with grace. But if the reflection wavered erratically or fractured oddly, as though disturbed by invisible movement, whispers spread quickly, and people exchanged uneasy glances, suggesting the couple would need strong resilience to face what lay ahead. And when the bowl was finally removed, the room released a collective breath, for the marriage mirror often stirred more unease than reassurance. Yet it remained a central tradition passed down through centuries, and by the time the night deepened and the last embers in the hearth grew dim, the final ritual of Part 2 emerged: the candle vigil, where the couple sat together in silence while a row of candles was lit before them, each flame representing a different aspect of life: home, health, fortune, loyalty, and harmony. And the goal was for all 5 candles to burn steadily for at least a minute. But in drafty medieval halls, candle flames rarely cooperated, and villagers watched the flames with bated breath, believing any flicker carried meaning. So when one flame leaned sharply to the side or wavered unpredictably, they hurried to interpret the sign, though not allowed, for speaking interpretations during the vigil was forbidden. And once the minute passed, the couple extinguished the candles together, symbolically taking control of whatever fate the flames hinted at, and as the hall fell into darkness for a brief heartbeat before lanterns were relit, an indescribable hush settled across the room. The kind of hush that only ancient traditions can conjure, the kind that made even the most skeptical villager feel the weight of countless generations watching, reminding everyone present that in medieval Europe, A wedding was never simply about two people. It was a spiritual crossroads, a convergence of past, present, future, and the unseen forces believed to move quietly through all three.